Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the final segment of the day on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And this is a really fascinating segment because I don't often do this on the show. I don't often talk about injured players and give you guys updates and subsequently supplement it with fantasy implications surrounding what this can mean not just for the player himself, but for the team. But this specific player is one of those players who may not be on your fantasy radar even this year, but is someone who can help a low-end team, and in terms of his timeline to return, and who the supplementary pieces to replace him on the roster are, I think that this merits a discussion, even though he may not be a guy who you're looking at right now. Without further ado, let's talk about Jonathan Brooks, a player who I'm all too familiar with as a Texas Longhorns fan. Let's talk about Jonathan Brooks. Obviously, replaced Bijan Robinson, so only 1 year as a Texas Longhorn overall. He averaged over 1,100 yards as a Texas Longhorn, but I believe in the last regular season game, he suffered a torn ACL. Played one meaningless snap in the Big 12 Championship, but outside of that, did not play in the CFP semifinal against Washington, and has translated into his NFL season. His draft stock actually did not suffer that much. Was a second-round pick for Carolina. They thought of him so highly that despite the injury concerns and despite knowing that they may have to sit him out for a couple of games, they took him with their second-round pick. He is, though, going to be on the physically unable to perform list, so that will mean he will miss at the very least 4 games, and week 5 will be his timeline to return. So, that being said, what does that mean for the player and the Carolina Panthers organization? Well, Carolina is willing to wait. They say that he is a long-term solution, so therefore they will not be rushing him back. So, that means that for the most part they're going to stick with the 2 guys they already have in Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. And I know what you're thinking. These guys certainly are not on my radar for fantasy this year. But the reason why this whole Jonathan Brooks saga translates so well to fantasy, even though it's just one injury, is because of all the implications this provides for a Carolina Panthers team that a lot of people may not even be thinking about in real life. But in fantasy, you can play a little bit of a psychological game here by picking up one of these guys. And that's what the fun is in terms of bringing this information, even though it's kind of a quote-unquote harrowing story about Jonathan Brooks, because we do wish him well. But in terms of fantasy, it's kind of a marathon, not a sprint here. And so we have to consider this from all angles and not just, from this injury to now, because of what it means for the long-term future. So, let's talk about where this leaves Carolina. So Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders, but splitting the roles. And it looks like Chuba Hubbard will be the RB1 to start the season. And once Jonathan Brooks comes back, Miles Sanders will go longer down the pecking order. So, let's talk about Chuba Hubbard especially. In weeks 6 through 18, he was actually the running back 24 in fantasy points per game, and he averaged 19 touches and 78 yards. However, in certain metrics that a lot of people respect in fantasy football circles, he did not rank that high. He was 30th in explosive run rate and 32nd in missed tackles. So you take your peaks with your valleys here. So, in terms of why I'm talking about what the Carolina Panthers running back room will look now. Let's say in your fantasy football league, or say in your fantasy football draft, you use one of 2 strategies, a hero running back or hero wide receiver. If you use the hero running back, there may be room in later round to take a flyer on a guy like Hubbard. That being said, I don't necessarily think for 5 weeks he will be the ultimate answer as your RB2 or as a flex player. But the advantage is, if, say, you are comfortable with the profile of your team, that you are willing to package Chuba Hubbard or let him be a streamer, as Tap to Learn says Sanders and limited in practice today may mean more for Hubbard. I think that's going to be the case. But what I'm saying about using Hubbard in terms of strategic purposes, let's say you do pick him up to the draft, maybe in a latter stage, maybe in, say, a 10th round or so. After week 5, when Jonathan Brooks is expected to come back, I think you can leverage Hubbard, whether by placing him on the waiver wire, finding another supplementary piece that you may have thought was better, or packaging him in a trade to further deepen your team. That's where you can start to play the game. That's where all the pieces of the puzzle start to fit. It's not just about saying, oh, woe is me, maybe Jonathan Brooks would have been fun if he was playing the whole season. It's about leveraging yourself for Brooks' return. Because if Brooks is projected to return by week 5, that means that he might be on the waiver wire for quite some time. And by week 5, people may have forgotten about him. And trading Hubbard for Brooks kind of makes a little bit of sense. But if you're not necessarily in that department, and the Panthers are right in their sentiment that they're not going to rush him back, then picking up Hubbard for a 5-week quote-unquote rental, and then either trading him with someone off the waiver wire or leveraging him could make a lot of sense. And I know it feels weird, because you would never, under any circumstance, think about a Panthers running back as someone who would pick up in any circumstance. I think that it, A, opens up your fantasy league a little bit more, and B, kind of is a fun experiment to really see how you can supplement your team. Because Hubbard, at least in drafting terms, is definitely a flyer. But once the season begins, the game can be played any way possible. You now have someone who could potentially be a decent 5-week rental, can step in when needed, either as a flex or an RB2, and then when Brooks comes back, or if he doesn't come back, you would be okay with giving him up. And I know I seem like I'm rambling on, but the point of all this is you can look at an injury in fantasy in so many ways. You can think about it in that, oh, I'm not going to touch this team at all because I don't want to be involved with trying to monitor injuries for a certain amount of time, get distracted by what I could be doing in terms of activity on the waiver wire or in terms of trading. Or you can say, hey, this is an advantage to me. A team with an injured player isn't immediately a death sentence for this team. It's one where I can play the game of fantasy and play it effectively. And now, this strategy certainly seems a little far-fetched. In fact, this is just a strategy that I'm saying off the cuff a little bit here. But if I were a fantasy football player and I saw that Jonathan Brooks was injured and nobody knew what his timeline was, I would start thinking about, on a week-by-week basis, how the goings-on in my league from the draft onwards would look like and how people look like. And hey, the fact that he's a rookie kind of helps even more, because now Chuba Hubbard becomes a hotter commodity, because not only is he going to presumptively start more than expected, but if Jonathan Brooks does come back, will they go with the hot hand and experience? So maybe Chuba Hubbard becomes even more valuable as the year goes on if you are looking at the trade path that I've laid forth. Then you can let on. Because then you can say to someone, say in week 7 or 8, hey, do you want to presumptively make a trade with me for some of my players? And you can offer Chuba Hubbard, and they wouldn't bat an eye. So it's all about this little chess game that you have to play in terms of fantasy. It's kind of sad that I'm talking about this over an injury, especially to a player who I really cherish and I really wish best for as a Texas Longhorns fan in his career. But it's also translating as a whole to what this means for the fantasy landscape, not just the Carolina Panthers, not just for Jonathan Brooks, not just for Miles Sanders, but for the overarching landscape of your fantasy league, because you could do something. And I'm saying that you can still do this even if your draft is done, because expect Hubbard to only be drafted. A Splash Bro helps me here. Hubbard only drafted in 24% in Yahoo leagues. Brooks drafted in 78%. So you can see that the discrepancy there really goes to show that Chuba Hubbard really is getting disrespected here in terms of, this is kind of like a Moneyball situation here, where you're leveraging certain values to better help your team and rather supplement your team, and in the process kind of make your league more wide open. So take this with a grain of salt, make of this what you will. Let me know what you think in the future comments, because it's a very interesting concept to try and delve into subsequent fantasy fallouts due to injury. But I definitely wanted to examine this one in particular because it's a weird one because of the Carolina Panthers profile and because of what Jonathan Brooks could have been. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you guys all for tuning in. Thank you for your lovely comments as well. You all have been excellent with that. Continue leaving your questions, comments, or concerns in the comments section. Also, make yourselves available to the super chats, super things, and super stickers features on YouTube, as we are now a live show. Any way that you interact is greatly appreciated by all at the show and the network. Speaking of the network, thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to live stream these shows. Check us out on every social media platform that you have. I have been Christopher Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow, same time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm out.